Hi, everybody. Welcome once again. Actually, I'd say for the first time, to the Only You, which is the English version of the podcast Solo 2. Why this is a unique experience. This is our first live version. Of course, we have Dr. Tino as the speaker, but also going to explain a little bit how this is going to go tonight, correct?
Yes, I mean, we really need to get into explaining that this is the first time we're doing it live, that we really appreciate those who are listening to us, those who are interested in knowing more about what we do, but also to try to give something back. So today we're going to try to give more about uh, our understanding of mental illness, our understanding of how we go about giving people a little back in terms of them getting more functional. Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit about mental illness and mental health in particular and try to understand the differences between those two. And again, we really appreciate those of you who are there waiting and wanting to listen to what we have to say, right?
I think that's a really good point. And yes, I want to thank the audience as well for participating. But I think it's a really good point. I have this conversation a lot with people that they don't understand the difference between mental health, which is something we all experience every day, just like our physical health, and mental illness, whether it's a temporary or chronic or terminal one.
Well, you see, I think it becomes important to to separate illness from health, right? And the difference is functionality. So when we're ill, we become dysfunctional. When we're healthy, we're more functional. So I think it's important to set the parameters, I think. Let's use sadness and depression as an example, right? Sadness is a normal reaction to loss. So we have to recognize that people get sad because they lose something. We also call it grieving. Depression, on the other hand, doesn't necessarily has to do with anything with loss. Sometimes gets initiated by loss, but the reality is that depression is about a lot of other things. For example, if you're depressed, you have difficulty sleeping, you have difficulty with your appetite, either too high or too low. You can have difficulty with your energy and you feel tired all the time. You feel unmotivated. Things that you used to enjoy, you don't enjoy anymore. You may feel achy. You may feel fatigued. And if you really listen to what I just said, I just described the flu, right? Said
Essentially,
that when
yes.
you have said that when you have depression, makes you very dysfunctional and you don't have a fever. Okay. Actually, we know now that depression has inflammatory parameters associated with as an illness. So think about you getting the flu for a month, right? And not being able to function for a month because you have the flu. Well, that's what people have to deal with when they're ill, when they have a mental illness of depression versus the waves of sadness that you get when you are in a situation of grief, right? So I always like to say, and I always like to remind people that it's very important that we have a memory of what it's like to be sad. And if you have depression, the memory of what is depression so you can separate it, right?
Because they are distinctly different things. I mean, everybody's sad, not everybody's necessarily depressed, especially clinically so.
Yes, and a lot of people come to us in psychiatry with the idea that they want us to help them be happy, right? And I always like to remind people that happiness is not necessarily a goal because happiness is not a constant state of mind. We always searching for happiness, right? But happiness is like the pinnacle of something, right? We
It's the
feel very
cherry on
happy.
top.
Exactly, it's the cherry on top. But I think that we need to get realistic about our lives, right? I hope that we can always be happy all the time, but the reality is that it doesn't happen like that. I always like to help people understand that we want people to be content. content is the goal, right? That you can balance the goodness and the badness of your life, and that you can live functionally. Unfortunately, we have this idea, and especially in well-developed countries, that happiness is a right, uh, that we or that is something that we deserve, right? And as far as I understand, happiness is the idea of earning, right? You work toward your happiness. Hence the title of our podcast, right? The Only You. And we can talk more about how we ended up with The Only You. But I think it's important that we keep letting people know that we need to be realistic. I like to usually start my conversations with people with a couple of questions. One is, what brings you to see me? Number one. And at the end, I always like to ask, how do you want me to help you? And that is important because whether you're depressed or you're anxious or you are suicidal or you're psychotic, okay, I want people to understand that they're guiding their treatment. I am not. I am there to providing guidance and options, but not direction. Okay. I don't have the power to give people direction. I have the power to give people options based on my knowledge and my experience and the things that I've done. But people always often ask me about um, two things: depression and anxiety. Those two things seem to be common denominator requests from people. They always want to know about depression and anxiety. And interestingly enough, both depression and anxiety can be symptoms like in sadness, or they can be illnesses, right? So we have to kind of learn to separate those two. And both of them lead to not functioning well. You're going to keep hearing me going back to functionality. Because at the end of the day, whether you have depression or anxiety or diabetes or hypertension or MS or whatever you have, is not what you have that is as important as what that is doing to your life,
I
right?
mean, theoretically, then somebody could come to you with depression or anxiety, being the most common. And if it's not to an extent that makes them dysfunctional, they don't really even have to choose to treat it.
Well, what happens is that it gets complicated. Let me get back to some basic concepts. Humanity, for practical purposes, has three components to it, right? Your biological component, your psychological component, and your social component. In order for us as humans to be able to balance our lives, right, we have to make sure that people are functionally stable in a biological, psychological, and social way. So let me use an example. Genetically, you have a history, you have family history, you have genetic background, and that may predispose you to certain illnesses. They may predispose you to depression, bipolar disorder, anxiety, all kinds of different things. But at the same time, you have a way of being, meaning you're born with a temperament that you mold into a personality later in life, right? The temperament is partially biological, personality is psychologically driven. So your personality is basically the way that you have developed to protect yourself from the world, right? So whatever life is going to throw at you, you're going to have a personality to deal with. By the way, there's no such a thing as normal personality, okay? So we've talked about that. And then there's your social environment. Your social environment is your education, your schooling, your friends, your family, all the people that you have to relate to, because we're social animals, right? Some people don't like me to use the word animals, but we are animals anyway. Um, so in order for you to be functional, you have to have your genetics and your predisposition to illness under watch. You have to have a balanced personality, and you have to have healthy relationships, right? So when people perceive themselves as being ill and they come to me or to any psychiatrist, they're really going to see and to ask to what extent they are defective, right? Because people tend to connect feeling bad with being defective. And myself working with so many kids, because I work with adolescents in the hospital, that's one of the main things that I have to deal with kids in the hospital, regardless of the problems they have, is that they don't have a concept yet of who they are, what they want, and where they're going. These are classical questions that every teenager will ask. Well, think about those multiplied 10 times, right? So when we start looking at your biology, your psychology, and your social environment, we have to look at a couple of things. How much do you have of whatever you have? How often do you have it? And what is it doing to your life? Right? You can pick any illness in medicine, and look at it from that lens, meaning whatever you have, how much do you have? How often do you have it? Meaning intensity, frequency, and function, right? And that's how we get to understand that people need help, right? When things are too frequent, too intense, and too dysfunctional, something needs to happen. Okay, something needs to be adjusted or modified, or something new has to be tried.
Okay. It seems that I think people don't define their own health and illnesses in a very healthy way, especially in mental health cases, because it makes us feel vulnerable. We have to admit to a fault or not being normal, quote unquote, of some sort. How do people manage that, or how do you help people manage that when they come to see you?
Well, we talked about depression, we talked about the symptoms of depression, and we talked about anxiety. We haven't talked much about the symptoms, but anxiety in general is excessive worry. You worry too much. There's always something in your mind that seems to be bothering you, right? So we try to accommodate, right, the symptoms the patient is having in connection to their day-to-day life. And then we have to provide him options to decrease the intensity, whether the intensity is genetic or biological, the intensity is psychological, or the intensity is social, right? Unfortunately, whether it's excessive worrying or whether it's biological major depressive problems, people think of treatment as an action. I mean, if I do this, this is going to go away. And it doesn't work like that. The treatment of most medical illnesses, not just mental health, but most medical illnesses, is not about fixing anything. It's about decreasing the intensity, frequency, and dysfunction associated with to a baseline, right? So if you have diabetes, right, and you come to an endocrinologist and you have the expectation that if they give you insulin or give you this other medication, your diabetes is going to go away, it's not going to happen. Diabetes does not go away. Hypertension doesn't go away, right? So what do? Well, we provide options that will reduce the intensity of the symptoms and will facilitate your recovery. But what people miss is that, especially here in the United States, is that they want you to fix it. People come to me with the idea is, I want you to take my depression away, right? And I would say, I can't. I don't have that much power. But I can tell you what things you can do to decrease the intensity. Yes, everybody's thinking about medications. Will medications help? They might, right? But medications at best are going to do 40% of the job. The other 60% is you. So if you go to the endocrinologist back with diabetes and you say, well, your insulin is not working, my blood sugar is still 300, and you say, well, yeah, but you're not following the diet and you're not exercising and you're not losing weight, right? You can't, and that's true for most illnesses. I mean, I remember my father, when he was alive, used to say, hey son, I know you feel very good because you're a doctor now, but I need to tell you that we don't cure anything. He said, well, if you can remove it with surgery or kill it with an antibiotic, that was for antivirals actually, then we don't cure anything. So the idea of going to the doctor to be fixed with something, it is irrational. You have to go to the doctor with the idea that I need you to give me options into what I have to do so I can make my life more functional, right? So, but that idea is like alien to most people because we have sold the idea that we can fix things, right? And I don't think it's fair to other people, to patients in general, that we live in with the idea that if you take these two pills, things are going to be better. Because the things being better is not a matter of medicine. It's a matter of choice. It's a matter of doing things differently. It's a matter of taking risks, right? And you said before that you have to do new things, you have to take some risks. Those are the risks I'm talking about. Risks that are new things that are good to you, or good for you.
But someone also has to come to the point where they accept that they have a chronic illness of sorts. I know that can be very depressing for people. I had a friend, I heard somebody say that what's the point if I have to keep coming back and keep doing these treatments? I can never actually be quote unquote normal. What's the point?
Well, I mean, you're getting into a philosophical question in terms of the value of life and what's important in life, right? I mean, you're getting into the issue of what am I doing this for? What am I in this world for? And I'm very familiar with that because I work with kids who are 12, 11 to 17 who think that their life is over, right? That I shouldn't be here. Because primarily in the hospital, we work with kids who want to die, they want to kill somebody else, but they're delusional, right? So those are the people that we see every day, myself and my team and my students. But the reality is that you're getting into existential questions, right? And I think that to some degree, and it's going to sound a little controversial, acceptance is overrated, right? And it's overrated because what choice do you have? I mean, what is there to accept? That you have diabetes? Okay. You have choices. You have the choice of negating it and dying from it, right? But you have the choice of doing something about it. But that's something you have to do. That cannot be done by somebody else, right?
So what's
And
your advice to people that fight that have that as their big challenge? I mean, you see patients every day, especially even these young children. How do you look at them in the eye and say, okay, this is why it's worth going on? I mean, you're not convincing them; they just have to come to the realization of their own. Correct?
well, you have to guide them because I mean, it gets complicated and you have to do your analysis biologically, psychologically, and socially. You have to know what you're treating. So that is something that we're good at. Okay, we're good at identifying biological, psychological, and social intensities that are causing dysfunction. That's the diagnostic part, right? So when I sit in front of a child, or I sit in front of a student with the child and myself, or we're analyzing somebody's history and presentation, my approach is always one of understanding, meaning, what do you really mean when you say that you want to die? Where is that coming from? I mean, are you really wanting to die, or are you really telling me that you're hurting too much? And I use a lot of paradoxical techniques with kids in particular because kids are not good at talking about feelings, right? They talk about their thoughts, but it's hard for them to communicate feelings. So they communicate feelings in interesting ways, right? So you have to try to understand, what are you trying to tell me by telling me that you want to die? And sometimes I would ask, well, how come you have not died? And that parents get very upset when I say that because they think that I'm being cold and calculating and cruel, right? Because I'm asking what keeps you alive. Because that's what I want to know. I want to know what keeps people alive. I mean, it's easy for me to understand why they want to die. And there's a lot of suffering on the people that we see in the hospital. People who have been seriously abused and tortured and mistreated and neglected and all of that, right? I can understand the pain. That's pretty obvious. But what is not that obvious is what keeps them going. I mean, I get these kids who are 16, 17 years old, and they've gone to hell and back 10 times. And they keep moving forward. They keep going. I'm very interested in knowing why do they stay alive? And I tell my students all the time that often we don't see people who kill themselves, right? Because they're dead. But I see the ones who don't. And there's always something to work with on those who get to us who've been thinking seriously about death, right? But they don't. Because if I can understand what keeps them alive, it gives me a little ray of hope of building something from that. Because people are not coming to you to take their suffering away. They're coming to you so you can give them a little hope. Because they feel hopeless. And that's a very dangerous feeling to have. But also speak for something genetic and biological, which is, our instinct. I mean, our instincts to be alive. That's something valuable, right? So when it comes to suffering, understanding is the code word, right? Because we don't have that much power to undo trauma, to undo neglect. And there seems to be a common denominator among the kids that I see, and is either actual or perceived neglect. And something we need to understand is that neglecting someone is a lot more damaging than abusing someone. Because the message you get to kids when you ignore them and when they tell them that they're failures and when you tell them that they're the worst things in the world is that they're going to try harder to get your attention. They're going to try harder to make you proud because actually before age 13, that's probably the kid's number one goal is to get their parents to be proud. If the parents are not able, okay, or if the parents are not willing, because it can happen both ways, or a combination of both, that kid is being told, you're not worth it. You're not worth my attention. And there are very few things in life that cause as much damage as that.
Mhm. So people do focus on physical abuse and sexual abuse, but you're saying neglect is actually the most detrimental.
Well, the problem is that those things are very obvious, right? But I would say have you tried to separate a child who's being physically abused from one of the parents? Have you tried to separate him from the parents? They'll fight you.
Wasn't there that experiment with the spiky monkeys, the spiky mommies? I can't remember what it was, where they actually had the rhesus monkeys and they would still cling to the mother that would physically hurt them because it was the mother.
Yes, you see, the dynamics of physical violence with children and with women and men are pretty interesting, because in a very sick and twisted way, abuse becomes a way of communicating, right? And unfortunately, some people grew up in an environment in which physical violence is a way of communicating, right? And they rather have that than to be neglected. So unfortunately, what I see with kids who've been traumatized physically and emotionally is that they also learn that they can get your attention by misbehaving, right? And that turns into some attention. Hey, negative attention is better than no attention at all. And that becomes problematic over time, right? So we have become neglectful in a lot of ways with our children at the same time that we believe that we are being protective, right? Like helicopter parenting is not necessarily a show of love.
It's control.
Exactly. But I mean, I was talking to a girl this morning. She's 11 years old. She wants to die. She's depressed, seriously depressed, and there's a family history of depression. She's never been treated before. And talking to her about how come, right? How come you feel that your life is done? And she will. I mean, we got into talking about her feeling she's not worth anything, right? And I said, well, how do you know you're not worth anything? I said, well, but I can't do anything right. You know, I have a couple of older brothers, and one of them is perfect, and I'm always being compared. You know, and I try and I try and I try, and I'm not able, so I must be bad. I must not need to be here, right? That's on top of her being depressed. So I told her, well, what happens if you tell your mom, I need a hug, right? And basically, what she told me is that her mom didn't know how to. Now, you're talking about a 12-year-old girl, right? And this is the story of my life every day. This is what I do every day, 10 of those every day. And invariably, if I go and tell and ask the kid, okay, I want you to tell me what makes you a good person, right? Invariably, they're going to say, well, I'm good at math, I'm good at basketball, I have pretty eyes, I can sing nice. And I say, well, hold on. Tell me what makes you a valuable human being, right? And they cannot answer that question. But that's not only for the kids that I see in the hospital, that's in general for adolescents today, right? Because we sold them on the idea that they're only worth as much as they accomplish. There is no value anymore in this country about being. So what I'm really asking them is, who are you? And then I said, okay, let me help you. And I said, okay, are you capable of loving? Yes. Are you capable of caring? Yes. Are you capable of being compassionate and giving and understanding? Yes. You know why we call those things? We call those things values, right? So what makes people valuable is their value, not how they use them, how they accomplish with them. It's the fact that they have them, right? So imagine feeling valueless since you're little. Now you're a teenager, right? And you still feel valueless. And the environment, something like COVID, right, makes you more isolated with less opportunity to get any feedback from the outside telling you you're worth something. We're having a crisis. We're having a crisis right now about kids wanting to die because they don't understand where the value comes from, right? So in those kids who have been traumatized and those kids who have had significant problems in the past, it's even worse, right? So imagine that you tell the kid, well, I understand that you're waking up every morning with somebody you don't like. What is it like to wake up every single day of your life with somebody you don't like or you hate? Right? It's not comfortable. You're going to have to look for excuses and things outside of you to distract you, right? To distract you from your pain, to distract you from your feeling of inadequacy. And some kids end up cutting themselves. Some kids end up trying to die, right? Some resort to drugs. Some die because of the drugs. So understanding and being able to give back to someone the idea that pills are going to help you, medications are going to help you reduce the intensity of your symptoms, but how do I help you wake up every morning with somebody you're comfortable with? Because what happens is you can see the writing on the wall, right? People who are intensely feeling inadequate, that they feel they're not worth anything, right? Eventually, they're going to find someone who's going to tell them everything they want to hear. They're going to tell them, you're wonderful. You're the best thing that ever happened to me. I'm going to love you forever, you know? And then what's going to happen? If that person goes away, it's the end of the world, because all the sense of value that you get comes from somebody liking you. So when we develop the concept of the only you, that's what we mean. We mean you are all you have. And you are the only person you're going to have for the rest of your life. And I'm not advocating selfishness. I'm advocating having control over the things that you do have control, right? Learning to give yourself a hug, because very often there won't be anybody to give you one.
Self-love, self-compassion, some
Yeah.
understanding.
So why? Because if you can take care of yourself, okay, then you can give yourself to the rest of the world as a happy, whole human being. It's not about you keeping it for yourself. It's about you knowing what you have to give, right? And that becomes terribly important. I think it's very important that we keep um, people focus on what do you have control over. I mean, say, well, okay, my boyfriend doesn't like me anymore, but you can't control it. You know, you have to live with the idea of not knowing sometimes. You okay?
Sorry about that.
Don't worry about it. You have to live with the idea of not knowing, and that takes us to the mother of all anxieties, which is uncertainty, right?
Which we're all living in right now a little bit due to the pandemic, which seems to be exacerbating all these issues a little bit more.
Well, that is making vulnerable people more vulnerable, right? That's basically what happens. So if you have vulnerabilities before, you're going to have them again. And I think it's important that we remind people that we do have a way of tolerating uncertainty, and it's by communication, communicating with other people. You see, we're so ashamed of what we feel, and we feel so inadequate about what we feel that we don't want anybody to hear it. I mean, sometimes I see couples, I don't do that very often, but when I see couples, I always have to tell them, why don't you tell your partner that you're feeling lonely? Why do you say, I feel vulnerable? Because we hear those things and we think of them as the defects, right? As inadequacies. I mean, no. It is okay to say somebody you feel safe with, I don't feel right. I feel inadequate. Okay, I need a hug. The most important thing on the other person who's listening to that is to listen to it. Because we have this tendency of wanting to fix things for people. Oh, don't feel that way. Don't talk like that. You're a wonderful person. And once you do that, that person is not going to trust you with their feelings anymore. And again, you have to be willing to listen and to hear what other people are saying so we can provide options.
It seems though that most people are poorly, well, trained to do that. And I've heard you talk about things like empathetic listening, non-judgmental listening. We're not programmed to do that pretty much anymore, or at all, are we?
Well, it doesn't come natural, okay? But growing up and maturing is about that, right? I mean, it's very easy for me to say this now after I've been a psychiatrist for 33 years, right? It's kind of easy. I've experienced a lot of things. I've listened to a lot of pain. So it's not the same when you're 15 or 25 or 30 or 45, but you have to have goals. You have to recognize that there needs to be balance in your life between your soul, your mind, and your environment. And I'm not trying to get too philosophical about that. We are part of something bigger, an environment that is bigger. And I'm not trying to get religious. I'm just trying to say we are part of something, but we only control what we do, what we say. And we're so afraid, of hurting others or what other people are going to feel, okay, or what they're going to think of us, that we just don't say it. And it just builds up and builds up and builds up. So we go from crisis to crisis, right? We have gotten very good at crisis management, but we're not very good at growing up.
Hmm.
So people live their lives from crisis to crisis to crisis. And part of the problem is that living in a dream, living in a cloud without wanting to look into what causes us pain, right? Can go on for a while until it stops, right? So there's some old concepts like purpose, right? What are we here for? What is my purpose? Not the purpose of my marriage or the purpose of my children. What is my purpose? And it's not about what makes me happy, you know? It's about what do I have to give? And we forget that we're giving all the time. And we can give good or we can give bad, right? So we need to balance those. And we have to be willing to take some risks. I mean, you and I have talked about this before, but I'm going to say it again. We get into these situations, in which we're so afraid of telling somebody we don't like them that we just don't say it, right? And in a healthy relationship, whether it's with your kids or your wife or your girlfriend or your friends, you have to be able to say, you know, I love you very much, but I don't like you. And that's okay, you know? And it takes a long time for people to realize that you don't have to like the people you love. And once you accept that and you recognize that and you're able to say it, things calm down.
It's interesting you said that. I've had an ongoing issue with my sisters concerning my mother and father. I don't speak to either of them, and it's been very many years. Um, and it took me a long time for them to hear me saying that.
Mhm.
I don't want to see my father. I love him, but every time I see him, I seem to cause him pain, and I don't want to cause him pain. I don't want to see my mother, not because I have a huge ill will against her. I just don't think she's a really good person, and I don't enjoy her company, and she's never been a real positive factor in my life. So I just, I'm just not going to do that. And it's amazing. I know for myself, it was very liberating to do that. Felt very good, but my sisters, had a hard time understanding it. One of them still doesn't. The other one finally said, "Okay, I think I understand."
Yeah, you see, what happens is when you, and we all have some degree of that, okay? Um, but I think that once you get to the point of not feeling yourself bad,
Hmm,
then you have conquered something, right? Now, you need to understand that your choices have consequences, right?
of course.
But you're not responsible for what they feel. Those of us who have children have learned that a long time ago, right? You don't have to like the people you love, especially when they're teenagers. You love them very much, but you don't like them. And that's okay. But we have to tell them, right? Because kids get confused between being liked and being loved.
Hmm.
And we need to remind them, right? I don't like you sometimes. I don't like your attitude. I don't like what you do. I don't like the risks that you're taking, right? But I love you. And I'm going to be here forever. Forever means my life, right? That's the only forever I know.
So you said that my stepdaughter's finally come to that conclusion with me. She's like, "Oh, you were so stern and so this." I said, "Look, kid, you were not a really nice person to your mom and to me and to other people." And I let her know. Just but she
Yeah,
realizes now that, hey, wow, I can always rely on you no matter what. And I'll
that's right.
always be there for her. Yep.
And I think that that has actually become quite critical with kids nowadays and social media and likes being the thing, right? How many friends you have on Facebook, how many um, I mean, how many likes you get, how many applauses you get on your TikTok or whatever. I don't know. I don't know how to measure that. But the reality is that people get into the idea that their value again is based on those things, you know. And there's a lot of learning and teaching that needs to happen with kids in terms of you're valuable because of your values. And I think that there's going to be a criticism of our society today. Our society has become a valueless society to a high degree, right?
It's all about accomplishment now.
Well, it's not only accomplishment, but being part of something, no matter how weird it is, or how difficult it is, or how politically radical, or how delusional it is. You know, if you feel that you belong to that, then you have some value, right? And that's extremely detrimental in the long term because people really have to get into the idea that uh, you are who you are, and your values come from what you've learned in terms of the goodness of life. And you haven't, even if you don't join any group or you don't belong to any social club or if you're not accepted in Facebook, that doesn't define your value. But that takes time. And we're fighting against that a lot more. Let me stop you for a second because I think we're getting close to, we're having like another 15 minutes. And if any of the people who are listening want to ask some questions, feel free to just write your question in the chat, and I'll try to answer them in the next 15 minutes. In the meantime, we'll keep talking about it. I'm just going to write down here questions welcome. All right, here we go. You know, go ahead.
Well, you were
No.
talking about, it's interesting how you're talking about how to approach people, how we look at certain things. You also mentioned how to treat people traditionally through medicines, but there are some interesting new things on the horizon, or actually being used experimentally right now. Ketamine, psilocybin, some other things that in the past were party drugs are now being looked at very seriously by the psychiatric, family. What are your take on those things? I know you're somewhat associated with that.
You know, we're going to have another program in the near future to talk a little bit about psychedelics. That's what we call them, right? There are certain substances that in the past have been used in medicine for other things, or there have been drugs of abuse like acid and psilocybin, which is mushrooms and things like that. And I think that you're going to find that those are going to be pretty fascinating into the future. Right now, we have been working with ketamine for a while. Ketamine is an anesthetic that is also known in the party scene as special K, because when somebody takes too much of it, it actually makes you hallucinate. So some kids think that hallucinating is fun, but they get dissociated. You know, dissociation means that disconnected from your reality. So you get into kind of a delusional state. Uh, but ketamine has a lot of applications, and for the last few years, and actually I direct a ketamine clinic in which we treat patients with treatment-resistant depression, bipolar depression, and so on. And we find that ketamine has a lot of uses in terms of getting people out of depression fast and facilitating the decrease of suicidal intent. Actually, we're starting, excuse me, hopefully starting a new research study on inhaled ketamine for the treatment of imminently suicidal adult patients. So that's going to be part of our research. And we're actually also starting a psychedelic research institute. And probably the next week or the week after, we're going to invite the lead person in that group that we're putting together. It's going to be a nationwide group. We got some people in Georgia, some people in Indiana, myself, and we're trying to put together this process by which we provide access to psychedelic treatments at the same time that we do research on them. So we're going to start with ketamine, which we find like a fascinating drug, right? I think it's very useful on other disorders too, and I think that there's going to be a lot of new stuff coming up in the pipeline And I mean, you can get into any of the search engines and just put psychedelics and psychiatry, and you'll see the amount of information you're going to get, which is really, really fascinating.
But of those, I mean, as you and I, we both had Kyle Kingsbury on this podcast a while back, and he was on yours, vice versa. He's working with those people through On It Sports also, and Aubrey and all those folks to look at alternative use. He's done ayahuasca in the past. Where do those things fit in? Those are, I mean, psilocybin we've heard about through medicine, we've heard through ketamine, but then for these more kind of edgy ones that are they being brought into the fold, or are they just kind of outliers?
Well, you see, there are two types of substances. One is the substances that already have what we call the FDA, Food and Drug Administration approval for other uses, like ketamine. Ketamine is an anesthetic, so it's widely available, and it's not difficult for us to get access to it. Then you get into the drugs that are not yet accepted by the FDA, and they're considered what is called class 1, which is drugs of abuse. So, but in that drug, the FDA still considers marijuana, heroin, cocaine, amphetamines, psilocybin, and so on. So we're working with the FDA to try to decriminalize those substances that have potential for psychiatric treatment and try to utilize them in research, right? You can do some of that with psilocybin is so prevalent now. I mean, you can actually go online and find it if you want to, right? Not that I'm suggesting or recommending you do that, but there are protocols that are already being used in terms of microdosing of psilocybin. I have patients with treatment-resistant depression who have fantastic response to those substances. I mean, fantastic response to psilocybin. I mean, after having failed all medications, I don't provide it. They procure it and secure it, and they get it, right?
Someone is at the front door calling.
Sorry. So from that perspective, I think that we have to keep in mind that we still have some process to do. Then you have the other substances like ayahuasca and some of the other hallucinogen type of drugs. And those in particular are interesting in trying to understand what are the substances in that plant or in that mushroom or whatever you're getting raw. There's got to be some substances that have a specific effect on the brain, right? And we're starting to see that with ketamine now. Ketamine is a very old drug, so it's very inexpensive, right? So so the researchers are starting to look at parts of the ketamine that may be more specific to certain aspects of treatment. There's a lot of research in that. There's actually a medication approved called S-ketamine, that is an inhaled form of ketamine that is very good to get people out of depression. So eventually we need to see if it's good at keeping people not depressed. So that's the challenge, is how long will the effect last? But with ketamine, I think that we have had a lot of experience with people getting pretty good supportive response, and you have a lot of different experiences in general. We do need to understand that the doses we use for ketamine are what we call subtherapeutic. We don't get people anesthetized. We don't put them to sleep. So we use subhypnotic doses, meaning you're not going to go to sleep.
So looking at that, the effectiveness of it, it's been looked at by the FDA. When can we, or people out there, maybe have it covered by insurance soon, or see it as a consistent? Well, because I mean that is a cost is the issue for any treatments. Obviously, that's part of it. But I mean, is it going to move to that level? Do you think? And if so, how long?
I don't anticipate that ketamine, the original molecule, let's say, as originally developed, will be approved by the FDA to treat depression unless we have very strong evidence, right? That we have placebo-controlled studies that show that is significantly more effective than the current treatments we have. And the reason is In this country, we always do the right thing, but very often we do it for the wrong reason. And it has to do with money. Because ketamine is an off-patent drug, right? And it's very inexpensive. Any pharmaceutical company can technically make it, right? That's what makes it very inexpensive. So since you don't have the exclusivity on the patent, you cannot charge a lot for it, right? Bravado, which is the drug that was developed, is an isomer, it's a left isomer of ketamine. All molecules have two sides. So they took one side and they patented that side, right? So now we have ketamine as a treatment, right? That is available. The problem is that it has to be done in a clinic. You get the infusion once a week, and it's about $1,000 an infusion, right? Or more. So you're talking about, and insurances are not very willing to pay for even that, right? So you tend to get into this situation in which you may end up paying more for a patented drug than from the old drug. And there's some advantages and disadvantages both sides, right? So the whole pharmacoeconomics is a slippery slope because in this country somebody's got to be made money out of it,
Mm.
right?
So you think these substances will just be, I guess, boutique driven, or for the short term or even midterm?
I would say the next 5 years are going to be critical, right, in terms of the opening up of some of these substances. The question is going to be how much is going to get decriminalized, right, and who's going to be providing the care and supervision of them. The problem with non-medical treatments or treatments not providing in a medical environment or in a pharmaceutical environment is that there's not a lot of safety net, right? So I think that these drugs are going to be available in the next 3 to 5 years, but there's going to be quite a bit of regulation.
Mm.
So now, I do think it's important to remember we started talking about biopsychosocial, biological, psychological, and social treatments. There are no panacea or magic treatments for anything, right? So if anybody comes and tells you, I can get you 5 infusions of X and your life is going to be different, just don't do it. Don't spend your money doing that because there's no such a thing. There are no free rides in anything that has to do with medicine. So you always have to go to what we know and what is safe, right? Because for a lot of people, nothing bad's going to happen, but for some people, something real bad's going to happen, right? So we have to take risks that are measured, right? I hope that after we come out of COVID in the next few months, we have learned about managing risk, at least, right? That we have a lot of power and control for what risks we take, right? And what risks we gave other people. But first, what are the risks that we're taking? If we didn't learn that from this last year, we're lost, right?
Well, hopefully we will and be able to, like you said, translate that into something we can do for others. Somebody asked me specifically about this podcast. I said, why are you doing this? I said, well, yeah, why else? To help people. And that's the
Yeah.
reason for all of this.
Yeah, and we are developing some other products in terms of helping people, in terms of giving them information and access and utilize what we have learned over the last 30 plus years in terms of training people, to be able to utilize the little we know in terms of helping and learning to listen and learning to ask the right questions. And more than ask the right questions, listen empathically, right?
Well,
Really-
you said that was an incredibly difficult skill, and providing some of that training maybe through this venue would be something our listeners would like. I know personally, I need to learn more about it myself.
Well, and we're almost at the end of the podcast, but I think it's important to leave all the audience with the idea that, and this is something that I heard. I didn't come up with this idea myself, but somebody said that God or nature gave us two ears and one mouth, right? So we have to listen more and talk less. But we have to listen with our hearts. Okay. We really need to understand, what are you trying to tell me? And sometimes we just have to say it, and instead of just reacting and responding, right? Because something that I've seen, and I was thinking about this morning during my thinking time, is that in today's society, people are almost listening, looking for your faults.
Mm.
I mean, people are getting so sensitive to listening to where your mistake is, to let you know that you made a mistake. I mean, our tolerance for other people's mistakes is almost nil. It's like we can't tolerate people saying the wrong thing, right? And I practice this with my kids a lot, because, and my kids not are not children. I have kids and grandkids, and very often I will challenge them with something I know they don't want to hear. Right? To see if they're listening to what I'm trying to say, or they're listening just for the words to tell me, Dad, don't say that. Right? Okay. But it's important that people get trained to listen for the meaning, not to listen to the words, because uh, we all make mistakes, right? And sometimes we have to say, I heard that you say that. What did you mean by it? And instead of assuming that we know the meaning, then we criticize the other person and we create a conflict.
Mm.
What's the purpose of the conflict? That I feel more powerful than you? That I know more than you? That I enjoy sarcastically and sadistically, that I make you feel terrible? And there's a lot of that happening, right? So let's take a step back and listen and ask the right question. Like, what do you mean? Or how can I help? Do you need a hug?
So what can the audience look forward to in this live version of The Only You coming in the future here?
Well, I think it's very important that people leave this talk today with the idea that perfection is not a goal, that happiness is not a goal, okay? That self growth allows us to be better in our communication and giving to others, right? And that we need to stop neglecting people. And there are a lot of ways to neglect people. There's nothing more damaging to the soul than neglect. If there was a magic wand to get rid of something, that's probably what I would get rid of: neglect. Well, thank you very much to everybody. Thank you very much, uh, Vince. I know this has been a trying day for you, so
It has been. Well, maybe we'll talk about that one the next time.
yeah.
For
And
all of you wondering, I am not only a host, I am a patient.
yes, yeah, and it's not only a host and a patient, he is my friend. So thank you, Vince. Really appreciate it. Good night to everybody, and we'll see you next week on Tuesday at 5:30. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We're done.
All right.
Wow.